Thanks for doing this. I really appreciate you.
Yeah, pressure's on mine. Thank you very much for being interested.
A little more than a year ago, I met John Hollis over Zoom.
Great story. I'm always happy to talk about it.
That great story that he's always happy to talk about isn't directly about John.
Most of my career is spent as a journalist.
So, John Hollis spent most of his professional life telling stories about other people. And a few years ago, he wrote a book about Medal of Honor recipient Marine Corps Sergeant Rodney Maxwell Davis, who was killed in action during the Vietnam War.
It was while I was married to the niece of Sergeant Rodney Davis that I first heard this story. And of course, I thought it was an amazing story. Then once I dove into it, found, did the research, interviewed more than 50 Marines who were there that day. That's when I really unearthed this amazing story.
My name is Josh Rowe, and this is Tomorrow Town, Tennessee.
I didn't realize. So you were married to the niece. Are you still married, or you were?
I'm not. I'm not.
Okay, you were married to his niece, and so tell me that. Tell me about being part of that family and kind of what is the story that's told among family members.
Well, they to them, Rodney Davis, obviously somebody they all will always remember and cherish, not just for being a war hero, but for the kind of man he was, the kind of brother he was, the kind of father and son he was, and friend. And I knew for a fact they make it very important for them, for their children coming up behind them, to all know about Rodney, what he did, how courageous he was, and how he willingly gave his life so that others may live, and how that sacrifice continues to be felt today.
So what made you want to write the book? How'd you get to that point?
As a reporter, you always, whenever you hear a great story, it immediately jumps at you. And This was an amazing story. I've always had an affinity for American history. My mother was a former high school American history teacher. So I've always grown up with affinity for American history, and grew up with a lot of military service in my family as well. My father, my uncle's buried at Arlington. My brother was a captain in the Army. So many men in my family served in the military. I did not. But I have great respect for the U.S. military and for the families and the sacrifices they make as well. So this is a story that naturally gravitated toward me. And being a reporter, knowing how to find information, knowing where to get information, how to dig it up, and how to get access to it came easy to me. So to me, it was almost like the story was like tailor made for me to do. So it just kind of worked out well. I know a lot of people in D.C. and I helped bring the story to life. And I would say of all the things I've done in my life, there's probably been no project I've ever done that's given me more personal and professional satisfaction than this one.
There is an outstanding video produced by the Congressional Medal of Honor Society where Rodney Davis's younger brother Robert said this about his older brother, quote, "He didn't take anything off of anybody, and he didn't let anybody mess with his family," close quote.
You hear that and you get a sense of who this person was, right? That the person that you're not going to mess with this family. You're not going to be pushed around. He was that kind of person.
It's funny that you ask about this, because in doing the research in this story, that's the first thing that jumped out at me as well. That growing up in segregation in the Jim Crow South in Macon, Georgia, where, as the second oldest of 5 kids, Rodney and his brother Gordon were charged to always look out for their brothers or sisters. Going outside the house back then in the Jim Crow South meant that the threat of violence was real. The threat of humiliation was very real every time they stepped outside their house. So their parents made it imperative that Rodney and his older brother Gordon to always look after your older brothers. That was like their chief mantra. Always take care of your family, look out after your own, and take care of your brothers and your sisters. And so that part jumped out at me, that he died as nobly as he lived, taking care of his new brothers, this time in the U.S. Marine Corps. He did what came naturally to him. It gives you goosebumps just thinking about it.
When you think about what he did, now I had a chance to talk to Kyle Carpenter a few years ago, who did something similar.
Fantastic.
To think about that, a live grenade on the ground, and you decide in that split second, right? There's not a lot of time to make that decision. And that's more instinct than anything else, right? You jumped on a grenade to save other people's lives. I mean, I don't even know what is inside someone to make them make that decision.
It's incredible. And I've told people so many times, when you hear the story, the first thing that you ask yourself, what would I do in that situation? That's the first question that comes to everybody's mind. And the fact is, you don't know. Until you're in that situation, you don't know, and there's no right or wrong answer. But the fact that Rodney Davis did so without the slightest bit of hesitation, it always amazes me, because had he hesitated in the slightest, that grenade would have gone off, they all would have died.
Right.
But the fact that he didn't, and not only did he not hesitate, but he used both hands to intentionally stuff it under his body. So he knew what he was doing. He knew what he was doing. It takes, an incredible man to willingly fight for a country that doesn't give you full rights as a citizen. It takes a more extraordinary one still to willingly lay down his life for that country. There aren't many men who would do what Rodney Davis did. I mean, I tip my hat to him, and I can't imagine the kind of courage that he had to do something like that. Especially when you have a 1 and 2 year old, you're married to the 1 and 2 year old daughter back home waiting for you. You've got friends and family who love you back home waiting for you. And you've been in country 3 weeks with 5 white guys, quite honestly, at the time of all the racial tensions going on, you knew the way that you were being treated and people that looked like you were being treated, and you didn't hesitate. Just shows you how much he loved his fellow Marines, how much he loved America.
In our last episode, I announced Tomorrowtown, Tennessee is going to Vietnam. Well, this story about Sergeant Davis is a big reason we're going. I'm traveling with John Hollis, members of the Davis family, and others to the location where Rodney Davis was killed in battle in service to his country. We'll have much more on our trip to Vietnam very soon.
You mentioned you talked to several Marines who were there with him. Tell me about.
Interviewed over 50 Marines were there that day.
Tell me what they told you. Tell me some of those stories that they explained, not only about that day, but just being around him and what it was like to serve with him.
Sure. Well, Rodney had been in country only 3 weeks when he was killed. He arrived on August 14th, 1967, and was killed on September 6th. So some of the guys knew him. I knew, like, one of the guys, Gary Peters, was the assistant machine gunner, 19-year-old assistant machine gunner, had only spoken with him once. I think it was like the day before they had spoken once, and they were just getting to know each other. It wasn't like they had gone through boot camp or anything together, had all this bonding from boot camp. They had just gotten to know each other. Rodney had just barely got to know some of these guys. The one Marine to his right, Randy Lee, the late Randy Lee, passed away 2 years ago. He had been in the hospital with malaria the day before. Had never even met Sergeant Davis, or even shared as much as a single word in conversation with him until the chaos of combat just happened to put him beside him in that battle. And so he had to go his whole life knowing that a guy he had never seen before, never met, or he had seen him, but the guy he had never met or even spoken with just gave you your life. He went on to have a great life with his family and kids and grandkids, all because Rodney Davis did what he did at that critical moment. I mean, it's heavy to think about. It really is.
I didn't understand that part. So Randy Leadham, he was the Marine that was closest to that grenade.
Correct. Well, there were 5 of them in that trench. And gotcha. Randy was to his right, his platoon commander to his left, and there were other Marines as well. But 5 of them were in harm's way. And the grenade, 2 grenades came in. One sailed high, made the Marines duck their heads. The other one hit another Marine in the leg and fell to the floor of the trench they were sharing. And it would have gone off, and had Rodney not jumped on it and taken that blast in his own body. He saved all their lives. There's no question.
The story you also told just then, right, about how they'd only been there for 3 weeks. At that point in the war, there was so much of guys coming in. Early in the war, they would bring whole units over, but that was not the way it was in 67, 68. You were bringing in guys at a time and putting them with other people they didn't know. So you really didn't have a history with people, at least at that point, 3 weeks in. I mean, there's no way for him to even, know these people very well.
Exactly. There's no sense of esprit de corps. I mean, he just knew they were Marines and they were his brothers, and he'd always been ingrained that from a young age, always look out after his own. And again, Rodney died as noble as he lived. He died looking out for his new brothers in the U.S. Marine Corps.
Tell me a little bit about Macon, Georgia. As you mentioned, 67. We're in the middle of civil rights era, right? We know segregation. We know that history there. I also know the story of Linwood Cemetery as well, right? He was buried on an all-black cemetery because at the time, explain what was going on in Macon. At the time, you couldn't bury black people in the same cemeteries. Is that how that worked inside the city?
That's correct. Okay. It was segregated. Macon was segregated in every sense of the word in 1967. It's going back as far as, like you said, the cemeteries. And that's another irony that really grabs me. These same Marines who Rodney died for, his brothers, he sacrificed his life for, he could not have come home and eaten in the same restaurants with them. Racism and segregation was deeply embedded in all throughout the South, but Macon was no different. At the end of World War II, for example, there were a lot of German and Italian POWs who were brought to Macon and 8 other South and Central Georgia cities to put to work on farms throughout the area while American servicemen were overseas fighting. After these German Italian citizens or Italian soldiers finished working, they were allowed to go into restaurants like in Macon and get food. African American soldiers, still in uniform from having just come back from overseas, were not. So racism was so deep and so ingrained that it superseded patriotism. And the fact that many of these German and Italian POWs were captured on the battlefields in North Africa, means some or all of them had Allied or American blood on their hands. That's how deep racism went in the South back then. So for Rodney to do what he did is absolutely astounding. And without any hesitation, it just boggles the brain.
It's a great point to think about how he grew up, right? And then when you get in the Marine Corps, it talks about this in the video, right? And I was in the Marine Corps. You're told there are dark Marines and or dark green and light green Marines, right? And that's how it was explained to you. And when I was in the 90s, that was still explained to you. But everything he knew before the Marine Corps in Macon, Georgia, was segregation. It really is. When you think about that, how remarkable that is for him to make that action.
It really is. And you look at the bigger picture, Vietnam was America's first fully integrated war. It was the first time many of those African-American soldiers and Marines had lived and, showered and ate among white Marine soldiers and Marines as well, and vice versa. And they realized you had the same hopes, you had the same fears, the same dreams, and we all believed the same color red.
You sent me some photos, and one was of Rodney Davis's widow and I believe one of his children there at the White House.
Yeah,
both
Judy
were there.
Yeah, Nikki and Samantha.
Mm-hmm. Tell me about the first time you saw that picture. I'm sure being in that family, that picture is something that is spoken about.
It breaks your heart. I mean, there's a picture that, you always say a picture says 1,000 words. That one to me always says several things. It says honor, courage, commitment, but it also screams about duty, about brotherhood, and ultimately sacrifice. And that's what you see in that picture is sacrifice, because you see Rodney's family there still grieving his loss. His 2 daughters, both toddlers, unable to ever remember their father. The both of them went on to have successful lives. One's a lawyer in South Florida. The other one's a banker in the Bay Area in California. But they never had their father walk down the aisle with them, go to their college graduations, high school graduations, none of that. And so while they're, to this day, will always be proud of their father, they both obviously miss him and wish they had him in their life.
What does the name Rodney Davis mean in Macon today? How is that name revered?
Well, Macon, Georgia, like a lot of places in Georgia, has a proud military history, and they take that very seriously. And so they had the city's one and only Medal of Honor recipient resting there is one of you. It is pretty powerful. But I always, I did note in my book as well that, it was different when all of a sudden when he's Medal of Honor recipient, all of a sudden it's Macon's Medal of Honor recipient. I'm not so sure it was that case before. I went back and did lots of research. I found a Macon Telegraph story where Rodney's death was reported. It was on page A10, the middle of page A10, A16. It was the middle of page A16, pretty much buried. It was just 3 lines. And conversely, the day before, and I certainly wish the best to anybody who lost loved ones over there. But 2 days before, a young second lieutenant from Macon was killed in Vietnam. His story of his death was crossed. It was A1. It was in the center page story with his picture, his name of his high school, his parents, blah blah blah. Rodney was more of an afterthought. Then all of a sudden, it was being announced that he was being investigated for the Medal of Honor. But all of a sudden, he was Macon's Medal of Honor recipient. Weird, right?
It's an interesting part of the story for sure. Do you feel like that today, because I've seen the video, one of the stations down there sent us some video of the cemetery, and it's sitting right by like a highway, right? So it's a visible, the monument that's been made is a visible thing. Do you feel like that they're in making people understand the weight of having a Medal of Honor recipient, from that town and having a visual reminder of that, for those folks?
They do. Again, military history, it carries a lot of weight in Macon, Georgia. I think, but for me, it was important to know not only the military aspect of it, but the black and white aspect of it, because that was a huge part of it, because that's influenced how they grew up, how they lived, their daily lives, everything. I remember one time meeting the former mayor of Macon, Georgia, and I told him, did you know all 5 of those Marines were white? He was dumbfounded. His jaw almost hit the floor. He did, and then, I don't blame him. He wouldn't have known, because as you know, as a Marine, when the Marines issue a release, it's not he saved 5 white Marines or 5 black Marines. He just saved 5 Marines. But that's an astounding detail that the city needed to know about.
Thank you for listening to Tomorrowtown, Tennessee. This podcast is a production of News Channel 9, Fox Chattanooga, and Sinclair Broadcast Group Chattanooga. I hope you join me again real soon.